On the left, Sally Cohn. On the right, Newt Gingrich. In the Crossfire, Congressman Adam Schiff from the Intelligence Committee and U.S. Senator Ron Johnson from the Foreign Relations Committee. In a dangerous world, can we count on Putin to protect Americans? Tonight on Crossfire.
Welcome to Crossfire. I'm Newt Gingrich on the right.
I'm Sally Cohn on the left. In the Crossfire tonight, a Democratic congressman and a Republican senator. Holding the Olympics in Russia was already wrong. Now it's scary and wrong, and getting scarier by the second. We just learned the U.S. is banning carry-on liquids on airline flights to Russia, following warnings about toothpaste tube bombs. And if that sounds like a joke, watch what one of them does to this car. Now listen to what Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Dianne Feinstein just told CNN's Jake Tapper.
I think people going to the Olympics should be careful. I think they should watch their backs. I think they should stay out of crowds if they can.
Like that's doable. The Olympics is one giant crowd. If I were a ticket holder or an athlete, I'd be scared. Wouldn't you be?
Well, I'd be sobered, but I do think Senator Feinstein sort of tried to get it both ways. If you shouldn't be in a crowd, you shouldn't go to the Olympics. I mean, if you're going to be in the Olympics, you're going to be in a crowd. And the question will be whether or not something terrible happens or whether it happens somewhere else around the world. In the Crossfire, Democratic Representative Adam Schiff and Republican Senator Ron Johnson. Let me ask you, if I might, Congressman, you all were briefed, I think, today. What's your sense? As you know, Senator Feinstein, who is the chair of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate from your state, indicated that she probably wouldn't go if she didn't have a family member participating. What's your sense of how big a challenge it would be to go to Sochi right now?
You know, if I had tickets to the Olympics, I would go. There is certainly a risk. No place around the world, regrettably, is very safe anymore, certainly not the Olympics with the threats we've been hearing about. But I think it's a manageable risk. You're not going to be able to avoid crowds, as you point out, but you can't avoid straying off the beaten path. You can take certain precautions in how you get to Sochi and not deviating from the instructions you're given by the security personnel on the ground. So you can take prudent precautions to reduce the risk. I think, as others have pointed out, that the risk is greatest outside of Sochi, outside of the Olympic Village, the transportation hubs. We've been hearing a lot about aircraft risks, but probably the train stations may be a greater risk than that.
You've said that the Russians are not sharing adequately in terms of information about what they're doing and what they think the threats are. What do you think they should be doing in terms of working with us that they're not?
Well, they'll give us information when there's an exterior threat. So if there are people in France or Austria or elsewhere that they have reason to believe are a threat, are going to come to Russia and pose a problem, they'll share that information because they have to. They need us and our European allies to act on it. But if it's information from within Russia that would reflect badly on the Russians, that would show the magnitude of the problem in Russia, that would disclose some of their sources and methods, they're not going to want to share that. They haven't been sharing that, at least not to the degree they could. And if we had the advantage of that information, we could better protect not only our people, but theirs as well.
So, Senator, let me pose a similar question to you. You've received briefings as well. You know the threat in Sochi as well as anyone. Would you go? Would you recommend to your constituents that they go or that they stay home?
Well, I think the congressman's assessment is pretty accurate. There's a heightened sense of concern. There should be. I think any reasonable person understands that there have been threats made. I think probably the greatest thing we've got going for us in terms of security is Vladimir Putin's reputation's on the line. And let's face it, Russia probably isn't quite as concerned as the U.S. in terms of civil liberties, and you know, they're not quite as respectful of human rights. So they haven't been afraid to kind of roll up plots and that type of thing, and they've got a lot of people on the ground there. So inside, I think the Olympic Village, I think the security level's about as safe as it's going to get. I think the greatest threat would be traveling. But the fact of the matter is, we live in a dangerous world. These threats that we face are real, and you know, people need to be mindful of that at all times.
I think that's fascinating. The brutishness of Putin may actually be an advantage. Say more about the fact that Russians have. I didn't think you were. That the Russians have said that if something does happen, God forbid, U.S. interests, the FBI, the CIA, will take a back seat to the Russian response. The Russians will coordinate the response on the ground. Are you comfortable with that?
I would like to see much greater cooperation. I think that's probably just going to be natural no matter what. I mean, if you're in the U.S., probably the exact same thing. It would be difficult to not have total cooperation. I would like to see probably more U.S. presence there. There's no doubt about it, but that's what it is. That's, it is what it is.
Let me build on something that Senator Johnson just said that I think is really troubling about the world we live in. This is not a comment on Putin so much, but they have been extraordinarily brutal, particularly in dealing with the Chechens. And they have killed an amazing number of people. And the result's been breeding a new generation of determined terrorists. I mean, it was no accident, I think, that the 2 bombers in Boston were Chechens. And the Chechens seem pretty good at terrorism, and they seem extraordinarily determined. As you think about our role around the world, and you think about the enemies we have among radical Islamism around the world, don't you find it really sobering that after all of this effort and all of this bloodshed, the Russians are, at this very moment, having to bring in 37,000 additional police just for the Sochi area because they can't break the back of this resistance?
I think that's exactly right, and it shows the double-edged sword that the Russian heavy-handed tactics bring. On the one hand, yes, they can have this ring of steel. They can bring all these resources in. Yes, they can surveil everything electronically and otherwise, and it's quite ironic that Snowden would be there when there's so much electronic surveillance going on in Russia right now. But by the same token, their crackdown, their vigorous crackdown in places like Dagestan, Chechnya, has resulted in fanning the flames of a lot of this militancy, has in part contributed to the problem that they're trying to confront. It's, I think, a sobering lesson in Russia. It's instructive not just for the Russians. I think it's instructive probably to all of us about some of the consequences of how we approach the terror problem and making sure that the actions that we take aren't counterproductive, that they don't grow the problem instead of shrink it.
You know, it's really surprising when you realize that Russia is under those same threats that we are, that they're not far more cooperative with us in the world. I was hoping that we had some shared interests, for example, in Syria, where we had that, the chemical weapons, trying to get our arms around there, but we've only recovered 4%. They're way behind schedule. I don't think there's any hope that we're going to actually stay on schedule to destroy all their chemical weapons capability by June 30th. And it's really Russia's role to make sure that that happens, and they're not making sure that happens. They're not cooperating anywhere near sufficiently with Iran. And of course, that is, the sponsor of state terrorism. So it is puzzling to me. I wish Russia were a friendly rival. But instead, they're unfriendly adversary. That's a real shame, and it is puzzling to me.
I'm glad you brought that up, Senator, because there's this sort of, we can all wish things for Russia, and that we're different, but nobody can deal with Putin. It's just sort of the situation seems to be deteriorating despite all attempts. And yet, Republicans have been fairly, to bring this back to some domestic politics for a second, Republicans have been fairly consistent in criticizing President Obama and his foreign policy in general, and in particular with respect to Russia. And yet, I'm curious, is there anything vis-a-vis Russia in general, or specifically to Syria or to Iran, that you would do differently?
Well, first of all, Sarah, I would like to think that politics can end at the water's edge. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's ever been the case. I would like to do that. And quite honestly, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it's a pretty bipartisan atmosphere there. Listen, these are enormously challenging problems we have. But the fact of the matter is, this president has, I think, just created some huge blunders. First and foremost is not negotiating a status of force agreement for Iraq, which I think would have prevented the Iranian overflights. I think Syria would not have been as big a disaster as it is. I mean, we sacrificed so much blood and treasure, and we didn't even leave behind a stabilizing force that really could have been helpful in the Middle East. So again, I really don't want to be particularly critical, but I mean, the fact matters you have to face reality.
No, I would have liked to have not gotten into the Iraq War in the first place. It would have solved it much better. But let me go back to the specific question, which is, how would you deal with Russia differently?
Well, I think you need to be dealing them with reality. You just can't hope. I mean, that's a terrible strategy. So, for example, I think we ought to be talking to Poland and Czech Republic. We unilaterally did not install those missile defense shields. There are reports that Russia is not abiding by the Intermediate Nuclear Treaty. That is a real problem. And so I think we need to make sure that we show some real strength toward Russia, and that's probably the best way to deal with them.
So Sochi is a real problem, but so is Boston, so is Silicon Valley. When we get back, I'll share with you the scariest story I read this week.